800 years before the invention of the term clickbait, Moses Maimonides wrote in his introduction to his Guide of the Perplexed that only 1 in 10,000 readers would be able to understand the book. Immediately after, he enumerated 7 different reasons contradictions appear in works, before ending his introduction with a declaration that only contradictions of the 5th and 7th type were to be found in the work. While clickbait ends after a single click, readers of and commentators on the guide have spent the past 800 years poring through its pages in search of contradictions and in hope of uncovering the truth behind the guide. Yet 800 years of writing has not produced much agreement on which contradictions appear in the guide, nor on which type of contradictions they are. It is somewhat easier to rule out certain types of contradictions from the guide. Thus, the guide is not a collection of disparate statements by different authors, like the Talmud, and consequently avoids the kinds of contradiction engendered by such works. The guide is also not the work of an author who changed his mind halfway through, nor is it a book of parables with inner meanings, like some books of the Bible. The only causes of contradictions in the guide, according to our editions of the text, are what Maimonides calls the 5th and 7th causes. That is, pedagogical contradictions that accompany simplified initial explanations and which contradict later, more detailed accounts, and those pertaining to obscure manners whose meanings must be withheld from the vulgar. Still, a tradition of Yemenite manuscripts of the guide, going back to the 14th century, adds the 6th cause of contradiction to those appearing in the guide. Contradictions of this kind appear only after many syllogisms based on many premises, such that authors who have not fully worked the consequences out of their syllogisms or worked out the consequences of their syllogisms may be unaware that such contradictions arise. Western manuscripts, however, do not include this kind of contradiction among those Maimonides says appear in the guide. Indeed, the notion that Maimonides would have admitted to including such contradictions as these in the guide is one that continues to generate vitriolic anger among some scholars, as I recently learned when I emailed one of the current editors of the guide in the Hebrew translation. Still, while I am convinced that Maimonides did not intentionally include contradictions of the 6th type, which are, after all, unintentional contradictions, there is a curious affinity between the reading of those Yemenite manuscripts and a short anonymous Hebrew commentary on Maimonides' notion of contradiction contained in 3 manuscripts, 2 of which are from the 14th century and 1 from the 15th century. Though it begins as a commentary on the causes of contradiction in general, that is, on that section of the introduction to the Guide of the Perplexed, in which Maimonides discusses contradictions, it concentrates exclusively on the 6th cause of contradictions. Not only does the commentary go into some detail explaining how a long series of syllogisms can lead, unbeknownst to the author, to contradictory conclusions, it exemplifies this with 2 extensive charts visualizing syllogistic inference. Taking nearly identical sets of premises, these charts lead to contradictory conclusions. Every man is a substance, and every man is a proprium. The premises in the charts differ only slightly from one another. More significantly, they are based either on commonplace logical premises, for example, every man is an animal, or every laughing thing is a man, or on assumptions from the physical sections of the guide. That is, the premises are included in or acceptable to the guide, and so the contradiction of the 6th type that ensues between a proprium and a substance is one that is itself included in the guide, or could be said to be included. The significance of this contradiction, however, extends beyond the vitriol-inducing question of whether to accept the readings of the Yemenite manuscripts to the question of how Maimonides can speak of God in human terms. After all, God is neither laughing nor an animal. Indeed, he is not a proprium and not a substance, at least not in the same way that a human being is. Accordingly, any discussion of God in human terms, a theme repeatedly at the heart of much of the guide, could not possibly be said of God. Nor could any description of a proprium or substance be applied to God whose absolute unity would preclude the proprium substance distinction. Pointing out this contradiction through the detailed inferential chart could thus be a way of calling into question the very possibility of syllogistic reasoning about God. For addressing the commentary on the sixth cause of contradiction in more detail, let us look at Maimonides' account of this type of contradiction. I bring it here from the Shlomo Pinus translation from the Arabic, though it has the Hebrew of Samuel Ibn T-Bone's translation next to it. So the text is this: the sixth cause. The contradiction is concealed and becomes evident only after many premises. The greater the number of premises needed to make the contradiction evident, the more concealed it is. It thus may escape the author who thinks there is no contradiction between his two original propositions. But if each proposition is considered separately, a true premise being joined to it and a necessary conclusion drawn, and this is done to every conclusion, a true premise being joined to it and the necessary conclusion drawn. After many syllogisms, the outcome of the matter will be that the two final conclusions are contradictory or contrary to each other. That is the kind of thing that escapes the attention of scholars who wrote books. The goal of the anonymous commentary is to explain this passage, which is indeed sometimes misunderstood, in terms of chains of inferences, often in rather formal terms. The anonymous commentary does this by quoting the lemata from this text as it appears in the 13th century Hebrew translation of Samuel Ibn T-Bone. Much of the textual commentary is explanations of terminology or somewhat greater precision in the language. Thus, for example, Samuel Ibn T-Bone had adopted the Hebrew term zelah, which usually refers to a decree, enactment, or even a restriction in Rabbinic Hebrew, but he used it to refer to proposition and sometimes even premise in his translation of the guide. This terminology was unique and did not stick, so much so that it is not even found in the logical translations made by Samuel's son-in-law, Jacob Anatoli, in 1232, a mere 20 years after the Hebrew translation of the guide. The anonymous commentary here takes some pains to restate the sentences involving this term with ones that do not. In my edition I have labeled as paragraph 5, the anonymous commentator also takes some pains to explain how terms of the first premise become terms in the conclusion. He also explains how premises are joined to others to lead to a conclusion, that is, a syllogism. That conclusion can then become the premise of another syllogism when it is joined by another premise leading to another conclusion, that is, forming another syllogism. Through iteration, we can get a sense of how series of syllogisms can be formed, building off of each other's conclusions. The point of the commentary is to show that such series of syllogisms can lead to conclusions that are far removed from the initial premises. Accordingly, it can happen that two series of syllogisms can lead to a contradiction that is far removed from the initial premises and so goes unnoticed by the one who mentions those premises. Just one second. Sorry. The greater part of the commentary is made up of two extensive charts depicting two such series of syllogisms, whose final conclusions do indeed contradict each other. The charts themselves resemble Porphyrian trees to some extent, and here are some Porphyrian trees in Hebrew, with some Latin and Hebrew letters on one of them. Both of the charts that we're going to see and the Porphyrian trees, they start at the top and establish inferences by working down. Both also use words on the left and right that move toward the middle. Moreover, both kinds of chart, at least in their Hebrew versions, have the option on the right side as the identical to the middle part of the chart, while the left shows the added content at each stage. In the case of the Porphyrian trees, the sections on the left are not connected to the progression of the tree. This directionality is generally reversed in Latin Porphyrian trees, whose readers begin from the left side of the page rather than the right. The charts of the anonymous commentary on the causes of contradictions similarly begin on the top right. They present a premise on the right-hand side and a second premise on the left-hand side, and then a conclusion on the next line or lines in the middle. The conclusion in the middle then becomes the premise on the right-hand side in the next line of the chart. I don't know if you can see the mouse here, but can you see the mouse? Yeah, okay, so this is the right-hand side. You have a premise, you have an added premise, and then you have the conclusion here in the middle. To each of these premises, another premise is attached on the left-hand side, and a conclusion is drawn one line down in the middle of the page. Moreover, aside from the first line of this chart, the parts of the syllogism are all carefully labeled. So these parts are three. You have here, you can see like premise, hakadama, on the right side of the page, attachment, seiruf, on the left side of the page, which is like the second or attached premise, and conclusion, toleda, in the middle, on the line or two below the premises and the attachments. In a few cases, some more labeling information is supplied. Thus, the first conclusion is labeled as, that's over here, as conclusion from the two premises, toledat shtei hakdamot. These additional labels do not appear to be very significant, but are so basic in character as to suggest that the reader is not someone very familiar with the structure of syllogisms. The format of the chart is essentially identical in all three manuscripts in which this text appears. This is especially noticeable since each of the three manuscripts is written in a different script. The Leiden manuscript, which is this one here, is a 15th century Spanish script. The Oxford manuscript is in a 14th century Spanish script, and then there's the Florence manuscript, which actually begins in an Italian hand, which is probably the same one that copied the other books and actually you can see here the beginning of it in the Codex, and this hand is dated to 1353. That's over here, but this hand does not complete our manuscript. The final section of the text in the Florence manuscript, which includes both of the charts, is in a 14th century ornate cursive Provençal script. The effort made in preserving the format of these charts by all three pens attests that the scribes considered them an integral part of the text. Accordingly, I also preserved the basic structure of the charts in my edition on mahadurot.com, and you're all invited to look it up there. This method of diagramming inference is not one I have seen in the Latin manuscript tradition. Indeed, Latin manuscripts like to place syllogisms in a single row, leaving spaces between each of the two premises and between them and the conclusion. So these you have a premise, conclusion. Thus, for example, in this 11th century Italian script copy of Boethius's commentary on Aristotle's Topics, which is now in Leiden, we can see three columns of premises and conclusion. This is much more efficient, and one can fit many more syllogisms onto a single page. I'm not an expert on depictions of syllogisms and syllogistic inference in Latin manuscripts, however, and would appreciate any further information. A diagram found in the margins of a 15th century manuscript in an Ashkenazi hand in Hamburg also portrays an introductory syllogism in three pieces. This one has some parts labeled as a minor term and a major term, Unfortunately, despite the loose graphical similarity to our text, this one is actually not a syllogism, but three disparate statements with labels. I suspect what we see here is something that's not complete. It appears, after all, in the margins of Samuel Ibn T-Bone's explanation of unusual terms in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. This text does not, as far as I can tell, make use of any of the propositions marked in this chart. Returning to our anonymous commentary on Maimonides' sixth cause of contradictions, we find two basic charts. The first, with an example of a syllogism from two premises. This is what starts here at the beginning. Every man is an animal, and every laughing thing is a man. It infers every laughing thing is an animal. The text then starts to diagram our first argument, which I present here in my own English translation, this time ordered from left to right. All right, so first premise, every man is an animal. First attachment, every animal is moved. First conclusion, if so, every man is moved. So we get then we get the next premise, every man is moved. Everything moved has a mover. If so, every man has a mover. Every man has a mover. Every mover is either internal or external. If so, every man's mover is either internal or external. So then we go, every man's mover is either internal or external. Every internal mover has a stop to its motion. If so, everything whose motion has a stop has an internal mover. Everything whose motion has a stop has an internal mover. We add to that, and man's motion has a stop. If so, every man's motion is internal. Man's motion is internal, and everything whose motion is internal has existence as a substantial thing. Then we get the conclusion that man has an existence as a substantial thing. Every man has existence as a substantial thing. To this we add the attachment, and the name man indicates existence as a substantial thing. So the conclusion is, if so, everything with the name man has existence as a substantial thing. Everything with the name man has existence as a substantial thing, and everything that has a substantial thing is a substance. Therefore, we get our final conclusion, every man is a substance. Now, some of the steps seem to be fallacious. For example, that every internal mover has a stop, which is around here. It does not in itself imply that only things with internal movers have a motion that comes to a stop. Perhaps indeed things with external movers, like stones that are moved by someone's hand, will come to a stop. In that case, even though the motion comes to a stop, it has an external mover. We cannot then infer that man has an internal mover because his motion comes to a stop. Still, I would not reject the claim that man has an internal mover, since man is, after all, a natural being. The author of this commentary does not tell us where he gets his attachments. The crucial ones come, in fact, from Maimonides' introduction to part 2 of the guide, where he lays out 26 premises needed for establishing the existence of the deity. These premises were extremely popular in the Middle Ages, and they were often commented on independently as a kind of logical introduction to physics. They were even translated into Latin, where Maimonides enjoyed a reception as a physicist. Premise 17 is relevant here. It is this premise that in Samuel Ibn T-Bone's translation begins, everything moved has a mover, kol mitnoea yesh lo menia, which is exactly the expression of the second attached premise in the first chart. So that's this. It's the same language even. Maimonides then divides the movers into external and internal, which we find here as the third attachment. As an example of things with an internal mover, Maimonides suggests animal, which is the first attachment. Maimonides ends his discussion of the 17th premise with the statement that something which is moved in essence by an internal mover has that mover's existence throughout has the mover in existence throughout its essence. So it pervades the essence, the mover. In the 12th premise, Maimonides says, quote, every force distributed through a body is finite because the body is finite. So if you take those together, it might be possible to infer that, quote, every internal mover has a stop to its motion, which is the fourth attachment. This will not solve the fallacy of external motion, such as the stone moved by a hand, an example which Maimonides himself gives in his discussion of premise 17. Still, the attachments themselves seem fairly reasonable. The final four attachments in the first chart are not, as far as I can tell in the guide, in those terms. They are not, however, in themselves difficult to accept, if you accept Aristotelian physics. Of course, the conclusion itself is fairly easy to accept, especially since it is well noted in every Porphyrian tree that every man is a substance. All right, the second chart is quite close to the first. The author has replaced every mention of man with laughing. He has also changed the object of the proof form existence as a substantial thing to existence as a proprium over here. He thus uses virtually the same pattern of inference with nearly the same attached premises to reach the conclusion that every laughing thing is a proprium. The contradiction here lies in the first syllogism, which had as a premise that every laughing thing is a man. Thus, it would seem to follow that every proprium is a man, and that every man is a substance, and therefore every proprium is a substance. This is, of course, a categorical error, and so a fallacy. Our commentator has thus done a quite elaborate job of arguing and depicting that based on the premises, every man is an animal and every laughing thing is an animal, we can make a chain of premises that reach the conclusion that every proprium is a substance. Thus, does the commentator exemplify the sixth contradiction. Moreover, while this sixth contradiction is not entirely made up of premises taken from the guide, it is primarily made up of such premises. Further, those premises are not mentioned in the guide, are not exactly foreign to it or rejected from it. So it is not impossible to see this short commentary as an indication that Maimonides himself may have been susceptible to the sixth contradiction. It is even possible to speculate, and here I'm going on a major limb, that this commentary or news of it made its way to Yemen in the 14th century, where a reader noted in the margin of the text next to Maimonides' statement that he only included contradictions of the fifth and seventh type in his work, that Maimonides, in fact, may have been susceptible to the sixth. And perhaps this marginal note was included in later texts, leading to a tradition of Yemenite manuscripts to include the sixth cause of contradictions as one of those that can be found in the guide. All right, conclusion. Actually, this fallacy is relatively easy to avoid. If instead of laughing in the second series of syllogisms, we say substance that laughs, we can adjust the rest of the chain so that it ends with the assertion that every substance that laughs has a proprium. This is accurate and does not conflict with the substantial character of the substance that laughs. We should also keep in mind that, as Maimonides notes in premise 6 of the introduction to the second part, different motions apply to different categories. So substantial motions, namely coming into being and passing away, are fundamentally different from qualitative motions, such as change of color or starting and stopping to laugh. The similarities of the two syllogism charts end when we consider how different these motions are. That is, it becomes clear relatively early on in the second chart that the motion must be fundamentally different, appropriate to a proprium, or else the motion of the substance whose proprium is laughter. What all this highlights, whether intentionally or not, is the difficulty in making syllogisms about God. Maimonides goes to great lengths to say that we cannot attribute any properties to God, nor can we speak with any meaning about God's substance. Still, he notes, we do in fact say things that at least appear to have such meanings, as when we say that God is great or God is merciful. Indeed, any such statement and any syllogism we would build off of such a statement about God would encounter the problem of which category could be predicated of God. We would indeed be liable to encounter the same problem of misattribution, and in fact many others. That is, we would ourselves be exposed to making statements that result in the sixth type of contradiction. Thank you very much for your attention.